Thank you very much.
Kia ora koutou. Hi everyone. My name is Gabor Kereszturi. First of all, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Hopefully. Yep.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you. So in my talk, I would like to just showcase some of the flagship research, what we do, what we have done and completed in the last couple of years. And also, first of all, I got a lot of co-authors, and I've been privileged to work with a lot of PhD students whom I supervise and co-supervise over the years. And I also listed here a bunch of other colleagues, mostly from New Zealand, but some of them are actually from overseas. So in my talk, I'm mostly focusing on the soil and environmental and earth science applications using hyperspectral remote sensing, both from the lab and also from the air. So New Zealand is a great place. We can have a lot of different processes. So we have bare land, for example, volcanoes, and we also have a lot of landslides, which actually requires quite a lot of monitoring work. So that's where remote sensing can be really handy to have both spatial, spectral, and temporal domains to keep track of what's been going on the ground. But also New Zealand has lots of pasture lands and also settlements and also pollution issues. For example, Lake Horowhenua is one of the most polluted lakes almost in the world. So all of these applications require information which remote sensing can provide, and all of those information can be pipelined to a proper decision making, not just to monitor volcanoes, but monitor all of these different processes at different time scales and spatial scales as well. So I reckon I can safely skip this slide after all of those talks. So as I said, I'm going to introduce you to the research we do in the hyperspectral space, mostly using Massey's isophoenix sensor, as well as the ground sensor, what we can use in the field and as well as in the lab. We also do currently a little bit of work with a new generation Prisma satellite, but I'm going to skip that results for now. So also I would like to step a little bit back and divide all of the different methods we can apply to hyperspectral imaging. So here I'm going to, in the first couple of slides, I'm going to go into which I dubbed them like indirect methods, where, for example, when we do remote sensing, we, for example, sense the surface of the earth, which is typically covered by plants, for example, in New Zealand. But sometimes the interest is not in the plant or to understand plant processes per se, but mostly to looking at what's underneath those layer of plants. So, for example, this is just a conceptual diagram when we have, for example, an ore body underneath. So that can be a couple of meters or a couple of tens of meters beneath the ground. And what we would like to see here is how that underlying body is actually impacting the surface reflectance, what we can track on the vegetation. So if we just recall all the water stress, so plant can be water stressed, and that water stress can change the reflectance properties of plants. So here we're applying the same principles, but then instead of water, we add metal or metalloids. So for example, if you can see here, we listed all the gold and also the arsenic concentrations typical for these layers. So if you start with 1000 ppm arsenic at deep underground, that will slowly leach out to the shallower layers, including soil, and then it's gradually dropping down. But arsenic is still present at 90 ppm level in the bark of trees, and also in the needle at around 40. So there is a transport of this metal or metalloid within this plant system, and that's which triggers this study, and we would like to detect that on the surface. So as I said, this is an indirect method, so we're not sensing concentration of arsenic, but we are sensing some other constituents which can be physical or chemical, which co-change with the level of arsenic. And also I added here thermal, because sometimes thermal or like heat impact on the plant can also be manifested and being measured using remote sensing techniques. This is a very busy graph, sorry for that, but this is a lab-based measurement of different trace elements. in soil, in bark, and in needle from two different studies, both from South Island. And what we can see here in the soils, there are pretty neat correlations, even though Gautam in this paper, he used a combination of different methods. But even though, because soil in this case quite close to that, and it actually holds that contaminants, in this case, all of these trace elements coming from fertilizer applications, the predictive models using partial least squares regression or support vector machine can be quite successfully predicting those constituents. But there is an increasing accuracy if we go closer to the surface. So bark can be still used, for example, predicting arsenic and also antimony. But all of these relationships gradually breaking down when we go into that the needle or leaf proportion of the surface cover, in this case a Pinus radiata, and we can't really see for arsenic, we can't really see any really general trend. Maybe there is something in the antimony properties. So overall there is a decreasing accuracy using lab-based detection. But now, on the other hand, we want to have a step further and then looking into how this tiny bit of information can be preserved or retrieved from remote sensing data. That's really a stretchy ground, and I all acknowledge that. But just for the sake of this exercise and the sake of having a new method developed, we need to look into those impossible situations as well, I suppose. Here we have the same study. So Rupsha did a great job there looking at this tiny plantation where we had more than 110 ground samples, and then we developed prediction models to predict the concentration of antimony within those plants. So antimony is important there because that's an important trace element for vectoring different ore bodies underneath. So here we have a shear zone, and we also have quite a lot of drill core information, and we know there is known underground mineralization there. And as this prediction map shows high like antimony concentrations along a few patches of the predictions. So based on that, we kind of, this would be the first sign to actually give credit to such sort of indirect methods in this mineral exploration space. Also, in the other example, we applied relatively the same technique, but with different elements. So in this case, antimony plus barium, and we did also arsenic and silver in Cecilia studies. So these are hydrothermal systems. So that's a Vita pool. So the famous champagne pool is sitting right in the middle. And we can see a really nice discoloration where we have a low barium concentration and gradually increasing barium concentration as we go and leave this leave the champagne pool area. So there is also a geological explanation for that. This is actually pretty consistent with the whole geological story. For example, all of the barium sulfate minerals are actually found just around where we can see the high barium precipitation or barium concentration predicted in plants. So seemingly these techniques actually can give us a really new tool to monitor surface changes and also shallow hydrological changes within hydrothermal systems. So these were a little bit of the frontiers, I would say, and we also use hyperspectral remote sensing to look at direct effects. So when I mean direct methods, I usually mean when we sense the surface, what we are actually interested in. So before we actually sensed vegetation, but that was just a proxy media, and here we actually sense the bare rock and bare soil exposure. So in these last few studies, we were looking into how hydrothermal alteration is impacting slope stability on volcanoes. So here you can see the darker areas are relatively stable, less altered areas. And also when we go towards these areas where we have this lighter tones or yellowish tones, that means we have more and more clay minerals and also sulfates, which making this rock mass gradually weaker and weaker. When we translate that and try to actually measure the physical properties, for example, the uniaxial compressive strengths of those rocks, here you can see an example of this color transition, and this is just a schematic like a model. When we go from gray towards, let's say, yellowish colors, and just how we can decrease the compressive strength measurements from about 250 to around 10. So essentially, this is the tendency, or this is the conceptual model that we would like to predict using partial least squares regression in this case, using only spectroscopy, lab-based spectroscopic techniques. Here you can see the measured versus predicted compressive strength measurements. And as you can see, there is a rough trend as well. But given that sometimes all of these alteration processes are not straightforward. So for example, when we have more and more clay, it can saturate and it might not actually leading to a gradual weakening as we would think, but it can actually strengthen up some of those rock masses. Therefore, having a model, something which can indicate that, would be really helpful to understand the broader, at a centimeter scale, alteration history towards more like the remote sensing scale alteration history. So also when we step back a little and then coming out from the lab and looking at the broader picture, we can also apply image classification methods where we can understand the distribution and the area covered by different mineral groups. And those mineral groups can represent those weakness zones within the volcanoes. So here you can see a surface classification image where we grouped the whole surface into 4 sort of geotechnical units based on the alteration history, and we combined the data with shallow geophysical techniques. So here we can see an aeromagnetic data, an inverted aeromagnetic data, to see where we have actual deep-seated alterations versus only surface alteration. And when we combine these 2 models together, so the surface and the subsurface, we can work out the likely volumes of those future landslides, and then we can pipeline into different numerical simulations and work out a sort of first order volcanic hazard assessment from these landslide. And that's what you can see here. So that's all about the combination of techniques, what we can do using remote sensing, as well as also quite a lot of data fusion. Because at the end, data fusion will be a really key part of looking at these complex natural systems when we are not just only relying on remote sensing data, but some other ancillary data, which can be environmental, temperature, and so on, to have a better representation of what we can measure and how we can use that in more like a modeling framework. So just, I think that was my last slide, and I'm happy to answer questions. Hopefully we do have a little bit of time, because I was really quick with this presentation and I didn't want to just go into those hard details, but I'm happy to answer any of those. And actually, I think CC and Gautam are in here as well.